Good evening and welcome to Politically Incorrect, the weekly show that discusses the week's big developments with the big political commentators of our times, Manishankar Iyer and Shobhan Das Gupta. Well, this week, the government scrambled to fix yet another political disaster as outrage grew over its definition of the poverty line. Accused of being callous and out of touch with reality, the government finally held a press conference to say it would not abandon the 26 or 32 rupee a day poverty line figures in rural and urban India, but it would also not use these figures to determine who would be eligible for government welfare schemes. We asked tonight, does poverty end at 26 rupees a day? And has this government failed India's poor? Mani, let me begin with you. The government's talked about socio-economic categories, which will now be used to determine who's eligible for government welfare schemes. But why is it still sticking to this ludicrously low figure?
I think what we need to do is to put this issue into a slightly larger perspective. Before independence, the annual average rate of growth of the Indian economy was 1% per annum. We might call that the Christian rate of growth, because when we raised it to between 3.5% and 4.5% per annum, Professor Raj Krishna of Chicago described that as the Hindu rate of growth. Now I think we can claim to have reached the Sikh rate of growth, because Dr. Manmohan Singh and Dr. Ahluwalia have succeeded in raising our GDP growth rates to something between 7 and 9%, depending upon the year. But the rate of poverty alleviation in the course of the 11th plan has been under 0.8% per annum, which shows that India is prospering, but Indians are not. And therefore, we seriously need to look at what do we mean by the poor. Hitherto, we had said that the poor can be defined as those below a particular line. Now, there's huge outrage at the moment that the figure is about 26 rupees per day for rural India and about 32 rupees for urban India. What surprises me is that there was no such outrage when a few years earlier, the same planning commission said that consumption at 9 rupees 50 a day is poverty. And in urban India, it's 12 rupees. In other words, they've raised it by 3 times to 26 rupees. But there's outrage now. Why? Because so much of what we call growth, the real growth is being siphoned off by the very, very rich. And this growth is translating into inflation as far as the lower middle class and the middle class is concerned. Now, it's the outrage of the lower and middle class on the inflation burden on them that has caused them to suddenly take up the cause of the poor. They should have taken it up a long time ago. And I think the answer lies in recognizing that a single national poverty line is an obscenity. It is ridiculous to suggest that somebody who earns 25 rupees or spends 25 rupees a day is poor, but if he spends 27 rupees a day, he becomes rich. What we need to understand is that poverty and wealth is a spectrum that goes from extreme poverty to extreme wealth. And we have all that in India. And this was understood better by Dr. Arjun Sen Gupta than by anybody in the Planning Commission, when he made the proposal that don't only look at the poor, look at those who go above the poverty line, whatever that line may be, but recognize till about double that, they are so vulnerable that if anything goes wrong, they tumble down. So he suggested a category called the poor and the vulnerable. Now, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, in his one of his TV interviews, press conferences the other day, accepted the idea that the poor and vulnerable do exist. But you should see the outrage in the Planning Commission in responses given, for instance, to me on the poverty line, saying, what does Dr. Sen Gupta know about these lines? How did they draw them? The fact of the matter is that about 80% of Indians are either poor or vulnerable, however you define it, and that poverty is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. It's not only a question of being deprived in the one dimension of income or wealth, there's also deprivation in education, deprivation in health, deprivation in nutrition, deprivation in being brought up. the nutrition standards, and so on and so forth.
NDTV's cricket app, Android and iPhone, fastest scorecard, special analysis, and much more. Download free. ndtv.com/apps.